Jessica Mayer, she's an astronaut. She's been to space several times. You get changes in the body, right? One of the changes that they're concerned with is the change in the shape of the eye. So the back of the eye will flatten, which she went up there nearsighted. So as you can see close, but had to wear glasses to see far away. And she came back with corrected vision, 2020. Gravitational force that's being pulled on us right now. I mean, I started studying high altitude physiology in medicine, doing research on how humans can survive and perform better at high altitudes. When you travel to a different time zone, so your circadian rhythm gets disrupted, that also disrupts the symbiotic relationship that you have with the bacteria in your intestines and your digestive system. Stress will impact what's in your sweat, the outcomes of it. Yeah. When pressure is now different, like it's higher than it normally would be, or the amount of fluid in the system. So you pee more. The Apollo Launch Center there, they had the big Saturn V rocket, and they have this like vault that has all these old artifacts that have been in space. One of the things they have there is Al Shepard's spacesuit, and it's got moon dust all over it from when he was on the moon, right? One of the things that's very interesting is that's the particulate matter, that moon dust, and we don't fully understand what that does to the respiratory system. But there's pathogens and things like that could grow on that could make us sick.
How do you treat it?
Exactly, we don't know how to treat it. How drugs respond in microgravity could be different. Space flights and exposure to microgravity is basically a form of accelerated aging, we're finding. These are just big question marks that we don't fully understand. There's a lot more that we need to know about that as well. And we're starting to get to a point where we can study that a little bit better, especially with commercial trips to space.
Welcome to another episode on Beyond Capable. This is your host, Eric Trinidad. Today we have with us Scott Ferguson, or Dr. Ferguson, but for purposes of the podcast, we'll call him Scott. Scott, you work at the Embry-Riddle University, correct?
Yeah.
What is it you do? And what's your role currently?
Yeah, so right now I'm an assistant professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. So basically, what I do is I teach. We're always we're educators, right? That's what we do first and foremost is we teach. So I teach like formal classes. So my teaching load is 2 and 2. So I teach 2 classes in the spring and 2 classes in the fall. Okay. And that's full-time teaching for me. The other, that's about 50% or half of like my normal job duties.
Okay.
The other half is the research, right? Which is all the stuff that, we'll talk about. Or we already have talked about, but those are the kind of the 2 mixes. And then we have like service things we have to do as well. So like, for example, we're building a new master's program for the aerospace physiology program there. We have a bachelor, so you can go in your Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Physiology. But there's no master's program there for that yet. So we build that, the faculty build that, and that's like extra work that you have to do, right? So there's a program coordinator and stuff like that. I don't do that, but I sit on different committees and things like that. Okay. So those are my 2 duties. The research side of things, I have a laboratory that I name. The other, that's about 50% or half of like my normal job duties.
Okay.
The other half is the research, right? Which is all the stuff that, we'll talk about. Or we already have talked about, but those are the kind of the 2 mixes. And then we have like service things we have to do as well. So like, for example, we're building a new master's program for the aerospace physiology program there. We have a bachelor, so you can go in your Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Physiology. But there's no master's program there for that yet. So we build that, the faculty build that, and that's like extra work that you have to do, right? So there's a program coordinator and stuff like that. I don't do that, but I sit on different committees and things like that. So those are my 2 duties. So the research side of things, I have a laboratory that I direct, that I run. Day to day with that, it's called the Integrative Aerospace and Exercise Physiology Laboratory, which, it's a mouthful, but basically what you're getting there is you're getting aerospace, which is, like flight studies, talking about flying, because we're an aeronautical university, and then physiology. All physiology is the study of how biological systems interact with one another.
Okay.
So biology, you can study all the way down to like the single cell, right? And then with physiology, we're trying to understand, okay, what is like a cell grouping, or like what we call an organ? How is that interacting with another organ? So for example, one of the things we study is how the skeletal muscle, what we use to move, interacts with the cardiac muscle, which is our heart, right? And what that means for survival and performance in different environments.
Oh,
so yeah, that's what we do. So in the lab, then the lab is pretty much student-led research. We oversee it, right? So my job as a leader of the lab is to direct the research that is run by our doctoral students. So while we're building a master's program for the aerospace physiology program, we already have a master's and a PhD program. So you're in your PhD doctor through the human factors department. And so I have doctoral students or PhD students that are in my lab that study and have their own projects going, one of which is that respiratory muscle training project. We're trying to improve exercise performance. So they direct the studies, or they run the studies. I direct them and make sure they're done appropriately. And then, they're collecting research data, analyzing that data. All of us are collectively, and then we write up research publications and we'll send those out to journals for peer review that I direct, that I run. So day to day with that, it's called the Integrative Aerospace and Exercise Physiology Laboratory, which, it's a mouthful, but basically what you're getting there is you're getting aerospace, which is, like flight studies, talking about flying, because we're an aeronautical university, and then physiology. All physiology is the study of how biological systems interact with one another. Okay. So biology, you can study all the way down to like the single cell, right? And then with physiology, we're trying to understand, okay, what is like a cell grouping, or like what we call an organ? How is that interacting with another organ? So for example, one of the things we study is how the skeletal muscle, what we use to move, interacts with the cardiac muscle, which is our heart, right? And what that means for survival and performance in different environments. And we'll send those out to journals for peer review. So they're reviewed by other colleagues in the field, people that may not know us, or probably shouldn't know us. It's blinded. So we have no idea who it is. And then they give us comments, and then we address it, and we send them back out. And then once it's accepted, it gets published. So that's kind of our currency that we use to publish science, and that's how everybody finds the science has been published, right? Yep. And scrutinized by other people in the field. So it's kind of good to go for the most part, right? Obviously, there's problems with peer review, but so there's that, and then there's got to be money, right? There's got to be money to do all this stuff. Yeah. Like everything costs a bunch of money. Research is not cheap. So my main job is really taking all those publications that we've published and telling a story in a way that a funding agency like the National Institutes of Health or American Heart Association or NASA will want to support our work. So I write a grant. Depending on the grant, it's going to have different formats and all that stuff. But like NIH usually is like 12 pages, and you tell your story. Here's the problem. Here's where the gap in the science is. Here's how we want to address that gap. And then you have a full detailed plan of how you're going to do that. Some of the grants, like one of them we're going for now, its goal is to help engage and encourage undergraduates to be involved in research, which is how I got my start. As an undergrad and bachelor student doing work in the lab. And so, you have to have a plan that you show, like, how are you going to involve students? And so that's a big part of the science part of my job is to try to find research funding. And that brings money into to the lab, which also brings money into the university as well, which helps build the reputation of the university and us to educate as well, because what you want in the education system is for those people to be the top of their field. Right. And the one way they're the top of the field is if they're actively doing the research, right? And they're engaged in the research to where they're finding out the next level of things, you know, that you need to understand. And they're undergoing that scrutiny of their other peers and whatnot. So yeah, that's what we try to do at Embry-Riddle. So I'm an assistant professor now. So that's what we call tenure track. So there's levels. Good game.
Yeah, right.
Which kind of is. But yeah, so the assistant's the first level. I will go up for promotion to associate level professor, which will come with tenure at that. So that's usually a 5-year process. It depends on the university. For us, it's 5 years. You go up for promotion. And at that point, everybody like scrutinizes, not everybody, like the administration will scrutinize what you've done so far, publications, how many grants you've gotten, where that money has come from, you know, who's given you the grants, how many students you've mentored, how many programs have you put together, how many committees have you sat on, other stuff. So I do associate, and then the next level after 5-10 years in that, you'll go up to full. So you see a full professor, they're at the top of the field that's outside of administration. You can go to like dean and associate dean and things like that, but they're not actively doing research. They might be, but their main job is administration, which is kind of running the departments. So that's kind of like it in a nutshell, like what I do.
How long you been there?
I'm starting my 3rd year.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, just finished 2 years, and yeah, we're rolling into the 3rd year. Got there in 2022.
Oh, okay. And so before we go into the nitty gritty of this, so what inspired you to go in this field?
It was kind of like by accident. So we were talking like a little bit earlier about like, you know, what it takes to be strong and all those things. So in high school, grew up on a farm. I did powerlifting. And so, yeah, I was kind of interested in like what it takes to be like a strong guy and like get better. So, you know, got into university and went to Kansas State University, and the plan was to actually go into the Air Force. Okay. And so I did ROTC and got into that. Started off as an engineering student. Okay. Promptly got a 1.5 GPA my first semester. Hey, so that's out of 4. Like, it's not good. So it's mostly like D's. I didn't fail anything, but it was mostly like C's and D's.
It's a hard degree, man.
Well, I wasn't going to class.
Oh, that's not going to help either.
So I wouldn't even know, right?
That's not going to help.
Go to class. So yeah, I didn't start well with that. My dad was an engineer, and I saw, I kind of fell into like I need to go to college type mentality. But I liked airplanes. I was like, okay, let's go do that. I wanted to fly. I wanted to be a pilot. So that was kind of the jam. So yeah, didn't go to class, but played a lot of video games, hang out with the boys, and then with ROTC, you meet a lot of people and friends with that. So yeah, did well in ROTC, like showed up to all my stuff. But yeah, obviously was like on probation after the first semester. And then second semester, I think I rolled and changed right into like business because my cousins were doing that. And that, I don't know, that I kind of, in my brain, it kind of seemed like easier.
Yeah, well, from engineering, I can see why you think that.
Yeah, at the time. So
too much math.
Yeah, exactly. Like I wasn't really into the math. So I switched, not formally, but I started going to those classes. I wasn't really that stoked on it, but I didn't really care because I just wanted to get the degree and then commission and go fly airplanes. Okay. So I did like mediocre through the next couple semesters, got into what would have been like, went to field training, was like doing well in ROTC and then doing enough to pass my classes. Okay. And then got into bodybuilding. I'd kind of had that powerlifting hangover a little bit from high school. And my buddies are like, hey, like, have you heard of kinesiology? Like it's those, like my buddies in kinesiology, and they study like human performance. I was like, cool, I'll check it out. And so basically, I looked into it a little bit more, and kinesiology, you break the word down, is the study of human movement.
Yeah, I was going to ask you for those people who don't know what it is. Yeah,
so that's what it is. Okay. And depending on the program, so Kansas State at the time had 2 kind of tracks you could go down. One was a physiology track, which is how biological systems work together, and the other is like public health, which is very broad, right? You can study like epidemiology, and then like all the way to like built environment, like how is your neighborhood built so people can like walk to and from work, like, physical activity and things like that. So I took the intro class, and there was a little bit of everything in that, and I really hooked on to like the physiology of what it means to perform. And I was like, this is my degree. Like, I want to do this.
That was the undergrad or grad?
Yeah, it was end of not the end of undergrad, end of my sophomore year.
Okay.
Which at the same time, I had a broken leg from intramural soccer.
Well, good timing.
So I was on crutches, like going to class, but I was still going to class,
Okay.
which is like a big thing. Like, not only was I going to class, but I had a broken leg and I was making it to class. So, I went to field training, came back, but it was still kind of like I just need to get the degree and go fly airplanes. Got into anatomy and physiology, which was like the big weeder class, 8 credit hour course, massive course. And, people kind of either made it or they didn't. And having been like a poor performer in the past in my grades, I was like just hoping to get by. Okay. Right. Try to get a C, pass it, move on, commission. Right. So, we're studying, and like at the time, like Adderall, I don't know if you heard of Adderall before. Yeah. So like a lot of the students were taking Adderall. And so a few of my buddies and I were like, all right, let's, we'll take Adderall. We'll study our butts off. We'll do well. And so we did. And I ended up doing pretty well. I started like getting B's and A's on some of the exams, which surprised me because I didn't know it was like possible with me. And so, that would have been end of sophomore year. We get into summer. I go to field training, and then come back and we have a great year. And basically, I'm moving into the upper class, get into physiology of exercise, and this is actually where I meet my doctoral mentor.
Oh, good.
So it was taught by 4 different professors. David Poole was one of them. Tom Barstow. I mean, these guys are all kind of like OGs in the exercise physiology world. David Poole, pulmonary physiologist, trained. He's Welsh guy. So he worked with Brian Whipp, who studied oxygen uptake kinetics, like basically how the muscles take up and use oxygen during exercise. And I really liked his section of that class. Reached out after we got through that section and said, hey, can I come check out your lab? And he said, we'll keep you in mind. So no, I got told no, because like my GPA was garbage still,
That makes sense.
And that's kind of what they're going by. It's like their currency then. So I said, okay. About simultaneously, one of the guys, there's kind of a backstory with that, but one of the guys that wasn't very fond of me, or a couple of my other friends, found out we were taking Adderall. So he went to our commander, who's a new commander at the time, and said like, hey, this guy has taken Adderall with me. So I got put under investigation. We had a brand new commander that year, and I was actually the cadet commander. So I was set up. I just got my pilot slot. I was going to go to fly airplanes, like the dream, So I was going to commission all that. But that commander left, and so the new guy's there, and then that guy brought up that topic to our commander. He was the new commander was by the book, academy grad, so I got put under investigation. I think the thought was like,
so he rat you out?
Yeah. So, but the thought I think was like that it was him and a couple of my other buddies, and we were all kind of tied at one point together. And, me being like an early 20-year-old guy, just got out of a breakup. The guy that ratted us out, his girlfriend was kind of sleeping around with some of the guys in the rec that we worked at, the weight room and stuff.
So his butt hurt.
So exactly. So unfortunately, I partook in that type of thing, and so he's pissed and like he's upset about that. So he ratted us out. And I think the guys went to the commander thinking like, hey, the commander will like bring Ferg, they call me Ferg, bring Ferg in, sit him down, and be like, hey man, you got to get your shit together. Like you're not supposed to be taking these you didn't have a prescription for it. Right? Yeah. It's illegal. Mm-hmm. And, you can get in big trouble and you get kicked out of the military, you lose your whole thing. And I think they thought that would like straighten me up and that would be that type of thing. Well, this new commander was by the book, put me under investigation. And so I had to write a statement. And, the core values of the Air Force, integrity first, service before self, excellence, all we do. So, I mean, I told the truth. I said, this is why we took it. This is where we got it. These guys did it as well. And so the other guys didn't get put under investigation, but they got asked to, write a letter as well, a statement, I guess. But they denied it. So I got disenrolled, and I had like, I don't know, a little bit less than a year left to go, and got kicked out of the program. Yeah, I went from being like the highest ranking cadet in there. So I was ranked, it had to be like top 3, because to get that position, basically it's all cadet run. They all do everything. And then the cadre, they're like actual officers. They like make sure we don't like screw it up.
Yeah,
you know? So yeah, we were there and we were running the detachment. I think it was like 100 kids, not a huge detachment, but I was set, had like the flight suit and everything. I was going to go fly airplanes. And then this is all when I was in that class, at exercise physiology class, and I just been like told no to come to the lab. Well, I asked again, and I did really well on an exam, his exam actually.
Okay.
I scored 103, which had extra credit, and I got that right.
Oh, wow.
Looking back, I actually guessed on that question, and I guessed right. And I don't know if he would have let me come to the lab otherwise. So it's kind of this weird chain of fate, right?
he didn't know.
Yeah. So he didn't know. So I snuck into the lab, So he said, yeah, come by, like, get a hold of our doctoral students, PhD students at the time. So I did, yeah. And I just basically kept showing up. All my friends were Air Force buddies, and that kind of all crumbled when I got, kicked out, disenrolled from the ROTC. There's a few that are still really tight. That I chatted with one the other day. But a lot of those guys, they kind of faded away. So I didn't really have anybody. So I just kept showing them to the lab. Yeah. And then like meeting Daniel Hirai. He's now faculty at Purdue. I'm actually going to go see him next month. Stephen Kopp, he's faculty at K-State. These guys are professors now. And, yeah, man, like I just kind of fell into the science.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so what was it about that field that made you go in every day, despite that, your personal life was all disarray? Like I said, you're a kid still. Yeah. So what was it about that made you go in?
I think it was the drive to like do something bigger. Honestly, I had a chip on my shoulder. Okay. And I've kind of gone back and thought about this now. And honestly, like I haven't told that Air Force story like this ever, but like I've only just recently gotten comfortable enough to like understand that like, yeah, you screwed up and this is what happened type of thing. But what drove me to go to the lab was like the chip on my shoulder was like, no, dude, like I'm going to succeed. Like I got to do something. And like I didn't really think a PhD was in my future, but like I did a master's, and it was like the medical aspect of the physiology. So both my mentors at K-State, David Poole and Tim Mush, they both had taught at medical schools. Okay. So David was at UCSD and taught in the Department of Physiology and Medicine there. And I think he postdoc there too before he taught. But then Tim was at Penn State in Hershey, and he was a professor there at medical school. So they came to K-State to start that program. And so their science is very relevant to patients with heart failure. Okay. And that's kind of what we study is exercise intolerance. So like while kinesiology is a study of human movement, like that's so broad, right? So what they do specifically is study what happens in patient populations. What does a disease do to impair functionality? Oh. So somebody with heart failure, they can barely get up and walk across the room, especially like class 4 heart failure. Well, that's because, the heart doesn't pump oxygen as well, but also because there's dysfunction in the muscle itself. And that's come about through a series of autonomic dysregulation and things like that. So it was one thing to we're basically engineers of the body. And so we figure out what the problem is and how to fix it with their different interventions, whether that's pharmacological like drugs or like nutritional interventions. And so that was like super intriguing. It was basically like what I was interested in the very first place that got me into kinesiology, which was like, well, how do we like perform better? Thing. And in this case, it wasn't like working with tip of the spear athletes. It was helping people, patients, that there's way more patients than there are professional athletes, right? Yeah. And then, a lot of this work was on preclinical models, animal models, rats and mice, because we can do measurements in those animals in the muscle that we can't do in humans because we just don't have the technology to do that. So they're under anesthesia. You're working anesthesia. You're doing sutures. You're doing microsurgeries, and that was cool. Like I thought that was really rad. So I thought it was cool. And my mentors were very successful. in the field, and they'd publish like hundreds of papers, It was just cool to go from, seeing this guy teach class with 100 kids in there to seeing like, oh, this is like where medicine comes from. This is how people figure out how to save lives. And then that, physicians will go and take that knowledge, or you'll teach it in medical school. The first 2 years of med school is like physiology.
Oh, wow. One thing I want to point out that you said, because as I was kind of interesting, that when you started going to college, you went for engineering, but it didn't work out. But then you mentioned that you're kind of engineer of the human body.
Yeah, I know.
So that was kind of cool you said that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just kind of figured that out recently. Those aren't my words; those are from David Ferguson. So before the podcast, we were talking about some of the work it's led me to like the Speedway.
Yep.
To study limitations in drivers of the Rolex 24. And David Ferguson's kind of the guy that's been doing that the most for like the last decade. And he's a guy I kind of worked with, not this last race in 24, but in 23 to do that stuff. And it's what he said. He's like, we're like engineers for the body. That's all it is.
It makes sense.
And you tell the teams that, and they kind of get it. Like, oh, because they're paying a bunch of money to like engineer the car.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what kept me going. I earned the master's just to see if like I could do it.
Mm-hmm.
Then the PhD students that were there that were kind of running the lab, they graduated and left. And yeah, the plan was like, hey, they asked my professor asked me like what I wanted to do. And I was like, I want to do what you guys do. I want to do science. Like, well, you stay and earn a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So, I did that. I wasn't paying for school because I taught classes as well.
Okay.
So yeah, you teach classes at the undergrad level, like labs, and then give you a tuition waiver.
Oh, wow.
And you get a small stipend too. It's not much, but you're
still work.
You're getting paid to go to school.
Yeah.
So we did that. And then, I stayed and earned a PhD. So I was at K-State like 9 years.
Wow. That's about half of your life.
Which was crazy. Yeah. It was like almost a third of my life when I left there. Yeah. So that's what did it.
So now you got your PhD, and so from there, now you're in Embry-Riddle.
Yeah.
So
right now.
So what are you working on over there?
So at Riddle, I've got a bunch of projects going on. So after K-State, I went to CU, so the Division of Cardiology there. And
okay.
Basically, you finish a PhD, like you can go get a job as a professor, but it's pretty tough, especially in my field. It varies different fields, but it's kind of like earning your MD, a DO, and then not doing a residency. So like our form of a residency is as a postdoc, what we call a postdoctoral fellowship. Postdoc. So I went to the cardiology and I did that at University of Colorado at their Anschutz Medical Campus. So I was there 4 years. And that got me studying sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia, and hemolytic diseases. And that's just like what the professor there, he's a big climber, a cool guy, David Irwin. A lot of Davids in my life. So yeah, he was studying that. But so that some of that work I'm carrying forward now. So I started studying what happens when red blood cells break open. It's a good process called hemolysis. Inside red blood cells, there's 250 million-ish hemoglobin molecules. And that's what carries our oxygen.
Okay.
Which is great. Like we need that, right? Yeah. So the bad thing is when red blood cells break open or lyse, you get hemolysis, those hemoglobin molecules come out and they'll actually scavenge up things, like gobble up things that we need to like dilate blood vessels. Nitric oxide is one of those things.
Oh, wow.
So not good, right? So patients with sickle cell disease, it's a very debilitating disease. And we've gotten better at treating it, but they have like severe exercise intolerance, and there's not a whole lot of people that are doing that work.
Okay.
So we're actually getting ready to publish a review to talk about exercise intolerance and sickle cell disease. It got favorable reviews, which is good. So we should have that thing out soon. But yeah, so I started studying exercise intolerance and sickle cell disease and hemolysis and hemolytic diseases. And so I brought that to Embry-Riddle. Another thing I've been interested in too is just hypoxia in general. So hypoxia is low oxygen, right? And that comes about in a variety of different ways. Like we have hypoxia that occurs when we have a blockage of blood flow. It happens in diseases, right? And that happens in sickle cell disease. You get like anemic hypoxia where you have low hemoglobin, which again happens in sickle cell. There's not enough what I call taxi cabs to carry the oxygen to the party.
Makes sense.
Which is like how I teach it.
Yeah.
That's how I teach it at Riddle. Talking about the hemoglobin is kind of the carrying molecule for oxygen. And when you're anemic, that's the problem. You don't have enough of that molecule to carry that oxygen to wherever it needs to go.
Okay.
Exercise sense, it's muscle. So yeah, that brought me into studying hypoxia. I was really into climbing. So I started climbing a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually picked that up at K-State as a grad student to help them get their rec center up and running with their climbing program. And then, yeah, I mean, I started studying high altitude physiology and medicine at CU, and with the hope of like going to high altitudes and doing research on how humans can survive and perform better at high altitudes. So doing that, I met Rob Roach, Professor Roach. He's an OG in like the high altitude world.
Wow.
So he's published textbooks, and he's done a lot of work. But he runs the Altitude Research Center there at CU, which is an altitude chamber. And so he had some projects going. One of which was with the Department of Defense, trying to improve exercise performance at altitude. Because, obviously, as you know, there's a lot of troops that live and hang out, they live at sea level, right?
Yeah.
And they train at sea level, but then they may need to rapidly deploy at high elevations within 24 hours notice, Yeah. Especially with special forces, so common than some of those other commands. So that's a problem for the body, right? You go from sea level here to 14,000, 15,000 feet.
Yeah.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
So that low oxygen tension, low barometric pressure means there's less oxygen per breath. So your respiratory muscles will account for that, and your body accounts for that by breathing more. Well, the respiratory muscle is a muscle just like other muscles. It will fatigue. And when it does so, it'll send signals that say, hey, we need more blood flow here. And that can actually steal blood flow. The respiratory muscle, your diaphragm, can steal blood flow from your locomotor muscles, the muscles we use for like running, like to do your job, And so, yeah, one of the projects we started in CU when I was finishing my postdoc was trying to train that diaphragm to improve exercise tolerance.
Oh, wow.
And try to prevent that stealing effect. So that's kind of the major project I have going right now at Embry-Riddle, is finishing that up. We got some promising data. Paper's about to go out. There's only an N of 7, so what that means is we only have 7 participants in that study. So it's underpowered statistically, but we had statistical significance even with 7 already on some of the values.
Data you have collected, what kind of things you found?
What do we found? Yeah, so basically what we did in Colorado was we put these participants through 5 weeks of an RMT, a respiratory muscle training. And essentially the type of training we used, there's 2 types, like strength training where you add resistance to your respiratory muscles, and the other one's like endurance training where you're breathing more. Obviously you can't like sit here and breathe more on your own without help, because you'll pass out, right? And the reason that happens is because you start blowing off more CO2, and if you drop your arterial levels of CO2, you get lightheaded, and eventually you'll pass out. So what we did is we regulate the amount of CO2 that's in the inhalation that'll cap your CO2 levels where they're supposed to be. It's called eukapnic hyperpnea.
Yeah, I can figure that.
So you'll have that stuff every day, right? But basically, yeah, it's fancy for saying like you're breathing more. We do endurance training with that. So we put them through that. They did it 3 times a week for 5 weeks. And we had pre and post measurements that we did at 16,000 feet altitude in the chamber, in an altitude chamber. And we saw an improvement. We did a time trial with them where they basically do a time trial at a given rating of perceived exertions, so intensity level that they feel. And then we did a VO2 max test. And so all 6 out of 7 participants improved their time trial performance, but we failed to reach statistical significance on that. Okay. But power did go up. So peak power during the max test did go up. Oh. So they're able to produce more power, which kind of fits the hypothesis. We wouldn't expect an increased VO2 max, but we would, if we're redistributing blood flow, it could change power output. And that's what we saw.
It makes sense.
So that's what we're following up now, that study here at Embry-Riddle. The first step is to do it at sea level. just see if we can recapitulate it at sea level. And then the second iteration will be done in a hypobaric. It's not hypobaric, it's normal baric, but it's a hypoxia chamber that we have at Riddle here.
So those people don't know what that is. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, so hypobaric would be like low, so hypo being low, and then baro is barometric pressure. So we're at sea level, and like the pressure is like 760 millimeters of mercury, right? So that's the pressure of all the air being pushed down on us.
Wow.
And inches of mercury is like 2.9 or 29.92, which if you're a pilot, that's like what you're reading it as. And then obviously that would fluctuate based on the weather, like what the weather's doing. And then major fluctuation, what we just talked about, is going to altitude. So if we were, let's say we're in Hawaii, right? We're in Hilo, which is at sea level, barometric pressure is 760, right? We hop in our car and we drive up to Mauna Kea, which is just shy of 14,000 feet. That barometric pressure is probably going to be like 500 or so. So the pressure drops, right? And again, so what that means is there's less molecules per breath, specifically less oxygen. So 760 is all the pressure from all of the air. Well, not all of the air is oxygen. Only 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen. So if you figure that out, right, you can take 760 times 0.21, which is 21%, and you end up like 150 or so, I think, for that. So that's at sea level, 150 millimeters of mercury worth of oxygen. And that's what you kind of have your starting point, because all oxygen has to go through diffusion to get from the air all the way down to your mitochondria and your cells. And that's all a passive process. There's no like physical action that uses ATP to do that, to move that oxygen molecule. So you have to have a gradient, high pressure to low pressure, right? So when we have a lower pressure to start, we don't get as much flow. It's like having lower pressure in your plumbing, right? When you turn on the faucet, you get less flow. Mm-hmm. Makes sense? Yeah. So that's hypobaria, when we reduce the pressure of the air. The other one's normal baric hypoxia, which we can change the O2 content without changing the pressure.
Oh, okay.
So when we do that, we just change the percentage of the oxygen, and we add in more nitrogen. So most of the air is nitrogen anyway. 21% is oxygen. Okay. At sea level right now, but we could like take this room, you could seal it off, and then you basically would add more nitrogen in than oxygen, and then you lower that down to like 16%. Wow. And then that would simulate what we would be like at like 10,000 feet or so.
So out of your 7 subjects, so when you say 6 of them had favorable data, mm-hmm. Can you go a little bit more into that?
The participants are told to like keep their rating of perceived exertion between 13 and 17. So we use like this Borg rating of perceived exertion scale. So what that basically boils down to is it's on the top end of like your fun zone, if that makes sense. You go out for a run, there's like easy, like a walk, right? Which you could do all day. That's what's considered being in your moderate intensity domain. And then if you go for like the run part, right, you can go at a pace that you could do for like 30 minutes or so. Mm-hmm. It feels fun. It's like a fun speed. Yeah. Kind of like a lower intensity roll in jiu-jitsu, right? Okay. That would be on the top end of sustainable for you. You could do it for 20, 30 minutes, no problem, right? Mm-hmm. Even up to an hour, maybe even 2 hours if you're used to it. But then if you go higher than that, you're in the red line, right? And you know how this feels. You're on borrowed time. You can only do it for a short amount of time. Uh-huh. So in the physiological order, it's what we call severe intensity exercise. Okay. So you're starting to like decay in physiological function. Basically, fatigue accumulates until you're exhausted. So in this study, we had the participants kind of stay on the top end of that fun pace for them. Okay. And so despite that, there was no change, right, in that fun pace or their rating of perceived exertion, how they felt about their intensity. But following the training, their power was up when they felt the same as they did before, if that makes sense. Yeah. So they didn't feel like they were exerting anymore, but they were. Okay. Right? If that makes sense to you. So that has a bunch of ramifications. Like obviously, like perception of fatigue is a big deal. And if you can change or alter perception of fatigue, that has like powerful consequences. Because how you feel impacts your day, right? Yeah, yeah. And impacts your performance, especially. And so that's kind of what we're chasing a little bit now is, what's going on there? Is it really impacting the perception of fatigue? And if so, how? And that's kind of what the Department of Human Factors does at Embry-Riddle Health. There are a lot of psychological aspects that go into that as well.
So I ask you about that. When you say perception, meaning it's like the mental factor of it. Like people like you. When you say people, you when you're competing in any kind of sport,
Mm-hmm.
the adrenaline is up, or you get anxious about what's going on. All that things come into factor.
Yeah, and so that's perception of your exercise output is kind of what we're trying to gauge with that. So the easiest way to think about it, we use the Borg scale, which doesn't go 1 to 10 because there's a scientific reason for it. I can't remember exactly what it is now, but it's so you don't kind of get used to, I guess, calling these numbers out in a way. So what you're probably used to is like a pain scale,
Okay.
like 1 to 10.
Yep.
You get asked that a lot. Like, I'm 1 to 10, like how bad is your pain? So yeah, it's the same thing, right? What is your perception of the exertion that you're doing there?
Got it.
And so that's kind of what we're using as a gauge to see like, how they're perceiving that given output.
Wow. So you mentioned before, you were working at the Rolex.
The 24.
Yeah. So what kind of data are you guys collecting there?
So David Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson, which is weird. It sounds like I'm talking about myself. But yeah, he's been doing it for a while. He's got all sorts of data. During that race, he collected heart rate. I think he got sweat rate. So there's just a cool little pod you can put on the skin.
Oh.
And it'll measure sweat rate, but it'll also, you can collect the sweat to see like what's in it. So they can see sort of, sweat in, sweat out type of thing. Because he knows also what they're consuming in terms of their electrolyte balances and things like that. And so you can see what's coming out. And stress will impact what's in your sweat, the outcomes.
Really?
Yeah. And I don't think he's quite gone down that road yet in terms of analyzing what the stress is doing specifically to the sweat. But that's some of the stuff he's been interested in there. My research came into understanding or trying to study the vascular effects or cardiovascular effects of the stress and what that stress is doing to their cardiovascular function and their health of their cardiovascular system. So one of the techniques we use is called post-occlusive reactive hyperemia, which is just a massive mouthful of stuff. But essentially what it allows us to do is measure cardiovascular health, and specifically what we call endothelial function. So if you have like a blood vessel, so like the circle, right? On the inside of the vessel, there's these little cells called endothelial cells, and they release the stuff called nitric oxide, which helps us dilate the blood vessels. When you go from rest to exercise, you want to dilate the blood vessel to the muscle to send more blood to the muscle, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of like turning on the faucet. That's what you're doing, is dilating that vessel.
Got it.
And you got enough pressure, so you got flow. So stress, though, in and of itself, mental stress can reduce the endothelial function, the health of those cells that line the cardiovascular system. And so what we do is we slap a cuff. It's kind of like it is a blood pressure cuff, but it will blow up to higher levels. And what we'll do is we'll put that cuff on. We don't inflate it quite yet. And then we put this thing called NIRS on, near infrared spectroscopy. And it's basically this little block that shines lights in that penetrate the skin. And that light will penetrate and then bounce off of the red blood cells. And it will measure the saturation of the hemoglobin, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated state. And so from that, you can get tissue oxygenation of tissue saturation, basically. And so what we'll do is we'll inflate the cuff, and what you'll see is this rate of decay of the tissue saturation. So it starts to drop down as O2 gets used, right? Because the muscle's still alive. It's still consuming oxygen. So the rate of decay that we see on that TSI, the tissue saturation index, that is your resting metabolic rate for the muscle. So it's the metabolism of the muscle.
Yeah.
Right? So we do that and we let it like bottom out. It takes about 5 minutes. So the cuff's inflated for 5 minutes. And then during that time, all of the vessels distal to or further away from that cuff, they're all trying to dilate because they don't have oxygen.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, oh my God, we need more blood.
Yeah.
So they're dilating. And so when you release the cuff, now it's like the dam's broke, right? And so you get this huge influx of blood, and that tissue saturation will spike back up real fast. And the rate at which it recovers is correlated to cardiovascular health, or the health of that vessel. So you want a real fast rate of rate of recovery. And then you actually want it to overshoot where it was and then come back down.
As a kid, we used to make a magic trick.
Oh yeah.
And I will just stick your wrist and I'll hold it really tight.
Yeah.
And then when I'm gonna close your fist, and when you open it, you're gonna feel a string coming out. It's because of the fact I'm holding the blood for a while. So when you, like you said, I let it go, the rush goes in, you feel sensation in your hand. And, oh my God, you didn't know.
You're causing an ischemic event. Yeah. That's all you're doing. So yeah, that's funny. Like you get like the tingling sensation and whatnot. You can come to the lab if you want to come check it out sometime. But yeah, that's what we were measuring. So we would measure that before the driver would get in to the car, and then after they would get out. And we would have a series of those measurements throughout the race. So we were working with Wayne Taylor Racing. So Ricky Taylor was there that year, and so we got measurements on him right before he got in. They're doing the color presentation, and all that stuff's going down, and we're in the pit box like measuring, doing those measurements I just explained to you. And so he finishes up, wraps up, gets in the car, and we're like wrapping up our stuff, and they're like, oh, like start your engines, like go. So it was pretty cool, like doing that.
Wow.
And then, they do the race, and then we'd catch them when they'd get out of the car. What we found with that, we didn't get a whole lot of samples from it because it's very chaotic. There's many differences between a racetrack and a lab setting. But what we did show in some of their data is that stress seems to be impacting that response. We don't know any details because we only made several measurements. But yeah, there's definitely some cool stuff to be found there for sure.
Let me ask something. Because when you're stressed out, your blood pressure goes up.
Yeah.
And for you to be on a resting phase or be calm.
Yeah.
That interferes with the whole situation, correct? Blood pressure can be a big factor when it comes to these things.
Yeah. I mean, so what you're going to do, you get a big sympathetic response, especially chronically if you have high sympathetic activity. So there's the autonomic nervous system, right? There's parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. Parasympathetic is kind of that rest, what we call like a rest response, what we use to like digest our food, dilate vessels in some regards. Obviously this gets deep pretty quick. Sympathetic on the other hand is like what happens when it's like the fight or flight response, where you like freak out, type thing. Survival mode kicks in. And that will cause an increase in cardiac output, an increase in heart rate. But then also constriction in some regions of the body, like the intestines, because we're not going to digest our food.
Correct.
That way we can send more blood to the legs, to the muscles to move, right? So if you're chronically elevated, your sympathetics, for whatever reason, it could be like sleep deprivation, just, poor environment, whatever, that can lead to hypertension and does oftentimes lead to hypertension, which is high blood pressure. So that's when you run into like the health issues with that. Chronically then, high blood pressure, you run into all sorts of problems with that. You can get into cardiac issues, right ventricular hypertrophy, basically like the right ventricle of the heart gets stronger than it should be, which can lead to like pulmonary hypertension. So you get hypertension in the lungs, which gives you fluid in the lungs, can give you fluid in the lungs, and can eventually lead to right heart failures, die, and then also vessel stiffening. So this cardiovascular system, you want like pliable vessels, that when your heart pumps, they stretch, right? And then they go back down and then stretch, go back down type thing. But unfortunately, like aging does this, but that aging process and stress will cause a stiffening of those vessels. So what happens then is when the heart pumps, that pressure gets reverberated back to the heart, and the heart has to work harder to overcome that increased pressure.
Wow.
So that can lead to a type of heart failure as well. And these are where diseases come from, right?
Okay.
So aging is one thing that does that. Space flight does it as well. Space flight's an exposure to microgravity is basically a form of accelerated aging. We're finding.
Oh, I'm gonna ask you about that 'cause I saw on your bio.
Yeah,
You guys were working on that.
yeah. I haven't specifically done a lot of research. I haven't published any papers on that stuff, right? But when I was studying hemolysis, hemolytic diseases, I got led into kind of down that rabbit hole. So when you go to space, you see an increase in hemolysis, and that's due to many reasons that we don't fully understand yet. But one of the things that we think is causing that is increased exposure to the radiation, right? Because there's no atmosphere to protect you. And the act of microgravity itself, or the exposure to microgravity itself, probably does some as well. But there's a recent paper that came out. I think it was in Nature. It was from a group out of Canada. I can't remember the author's name. It's been probably a couple of years now already. But they're showing, and we've known for a while that hemolysis goes up, and therefore your hemoglobin levels can go down. Which we talked about earlier, right? You need taxi cabs to carry the oxygen, so you can become anemic, right? To some degree. So that group in Canada showed that hemolysis is happening. Red blood cells are breaking open, and that causes problems within the vessels. And so I kind of went down that road a little bit, studying hemolysis specifically with an interest of, okay, what is that going to do for astronauts? But we haven't made any measurements in astronauts yet. The questions are just kind of there, right? That need to be answered for sure.
Guys plan eventually get that work?
We'd like to. Anybody from NASA listening right now, we've got some ideas. There's some funding mechanisms that we'd like to pursue, that we're interested in trying to answer some of those questions. Long duration space flight is, it's hard on the body, right? So, and that's even like low Earth orbit type stuff. Now we're starting to try to go back to the moon and stay at the moon longer. And there's a lot of problems associated with that, a lot of complications. Like there was a recent paper that came out talking about like renal function changing, like renal atrophy, so shrinking of the kidneys.
Oh wow,
which isn't good, right?
We need those.
So we got to have those guys. I think there's a lot to be done there. Like I know there's a lot to be done there. We have to make the connections. We're lucky enough the Kennedy Space Center is just down the road. And Embry-Riddle does a really good job of sort of helping us make those connections with industry as well, because they're a private school, because they already have a lot of connections with major aviation companies. They're kind of used to that, and so they've brought people through, like from Sierra Space before, which they're a private space company. They're based out of Colorado, and they've come through and just like toured our lab, like had lunch with us and stuff. And we're like at lunch having a chat. I like had a chat with this guy. He's been in my lab, like what we've been doing for like the last hour, and we had some good conversations, and he's a physician. And I was like, oh, cool. He's like a doc, and so he kind of like understands a lot of the medical stuff. And he starts telling this story, and he's like, oh yeah, I remember when I was like on station, and I remember like looking out into space and seeing this thing flying around. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what that is. And I was like, wait, are you an astronaut? He's like, yeah. Like I was on the International Space Station.
Okay.
You went up in the shuttle. Yeah. And so like that stuff happens. You're like, holy cow, man.
It's pretty cool.
So they'll bring people in from NASA, and we've been lucky enough to have some folks like that come tour the lab. But a lot of it comes down to me having the time and being able to find the right people to sort of pitch these ideas to through grants, which is kind of my main job.
So kind of on the same subject of space and everything. So based upon your research and your knowledge, astronaut goes several times to space. Yeah.
Exposure to space. Yeah. Like that stuff adds up. Man, who did I just see present? It's going to drive me crazy. I can go look it up. But she was Jessica Meir. That's who it was, Meir. But she's an astronaut, and she gave the keynote, like the closing keynote at the American Physiological Society's annual conference in Long Beach this last year. And she gave like an awesome talk about stuff like that. So she's been to space several times. And she most notably, I think, was there like 120 days or so. It was a while. It was like a long time. And for a while, they didn't think, you get changes on the body, right? One of the changes that they're concerned with is the change in the shape of the eye. So the back of the eye will flatten, and I can't remember what it's called now. This obviously I need to know. I don't know it, but they didn't think that occurred in females. But not only did it occur in her, it like occurred at an accelerated rate.
Really?
So yeah, so exposure to the microgravity impacted the shape of her eye, but it also, so she had this flattening of the eye that doesn't necessarily go away when you go back to Earth. One of the things that did change was how her rods and cones interact in her eye. So basically she went up there nearsighted. So as you can see close, but had to wear glasses to see far away. And she came back with corrected vision, 2020.
I should go to space then.
Yeah. So her joke was like, is the most expensive like corrective eye surgery in like the history of mankind.
That's really interesting.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty
wild stuff. So that stuff's happening. Yeah. Like repetitive jaunts to space. I'm sure there's a lot there that we don't understand that we're just now starting to get. That happens with pilots too. Career pilots that spend a lot of time in high altitudes. There's less atmosphere up there. They're exposed to more radiation.
So Scott, given your background and your field, what do you think about the effects of the human body of astronauts who will do repetitive trips up there?
Yeah. So like repetitive trips to space, definitely they're gonna take their toll, right? So you're gonna get this repetitive exposure to accelerated aging. There's a lot more that we need to know about that as well. And we're starting to get to a point where we can study that a little bit better, especially with commercial trips to space. It's starting to happen. Like it's nuts, right? We have SpaceX, like they're launching rockets like
every other day.
Yeah, exactly. Like literally every other day it's going on now, which is really cool to watch, by the way. If you haven't ever been like seen a rocket launch, got to check that out.
Pretty cool.
So that's starting to be something that we can study a little bit easier. And again, these are things that I need to position our lab and our university into a place where we can make those measurements. And so what that means is whether that's pitching a grant idea, a research proposal to these companies, and showcasing why it's important for humanity in general and like their mission for their commercial reasons, whatever they need to do, long duration space flight, all those things, development of things in space. And so, that's kind of what we need to do in the short term for Embry-Riddle in the lab down there.
So when doing those trips up there, like any organs or any effect on them?
Yeah. So when you go to space, it's different, right? It's different than being on the ground. So one of the things that we're experiencing right now, everybody's experiencing, those listening to this podcast right now, unless you're in space. Yeah. In which case, cool. Your podcast made it to space.
That'll be awesome.
But there's one G, right? One gravitational force that's being pulled on us right now. And so what that does, especially as we're upright, or we stand upright, we sit upright, that pulls our blood down to the legs, right? And the tendency to kind of like have more blood pressure in the legs. It's not even a tendency. You will have more blood pressure in the legs than you do like in your head, right? So when you get your blood pressure measured, you get your blood pressure measured in your arm. That's supposed to be close to the heart, right? The same height of the heart. So that gives us your two pressures. A 120 over 80 is normal. That's your systolic and diastolic, which just means that's the pressure when your heart contracts and when it relaxes. Two numbers there. The difference is when you go to space, now the pressure is the same throughout the body because there's no G's, right? That's pulling that blood down. It's pooling that blood. Like, the water in our cup's being pulled down right now. Right, which keeps it in the cup. That's not happening in space. It's able to go everywhere. So now you have pressure sensors in your neck called the carotid bodies. And so what they will do is sense pressure, and all they are is stretch sensors. So when there's high pressure, it stretches the vessel, and that sends a signal to the brain that says, hey, we need to lower pressure. So it'll lower cardiac output or lower heart rate, On the flip side, if you have low pressure, it will increase cardiac output and constrict those vessels to increase pressure. So when pressure is now different, like it's higher than it normally would be when you're on the ground, that sends a signal that says, hey, we've got high pressure. So the body will lower cardiac output, but in the long term, it will also diurese or like it will lower the amount of fluid in the system.
Oh, wow.
So you pee more. So what happens is your kidneys lower the fluid in the blood, and that causes blood volume to go down in short term.
Wow.
So that's a major change that occurs. What are some other things that happen? You also get changes in like where the volume is within the body itself. So because there's higher blood pressure in the system up higher, you'll get your tissue will actually take up some of that plasma and some of that fluid in the cells as well. So a lot of times, like astronauts will they'll complain of like their teeth hurting or their eyes kind of hurting a little bit, which is why we think some of the ocular changes occurs, because you're getting changes in the pressure in the eye because of all these things that aren't there with gravity, right? So those are some of the changes that occur that impact the whole body, just because of gravity or lack thereof, right?
You mentioned in conversation that you went to see was a keynote speaker that
Yeah, Jessica. Yeah, astronaut Meyer. Yeah.
You mentioned about her eyes, something like that. Go into that a little bit.
Yeah. So she I should have looked up the name of the ocular issue that she had. I could probably find it on my phone if you really wanted me to. But basically it's a flattening of the backside of the eye. And so what that can cause is issues like with the nerves and how they interact with the eye. And it doesn't really go away when they come back to Earth, right? So that's a big consideration. Like, okay, like, are your eyes going to change when you're in, let's say, on a mission to Mars, for example?
Yeah.
It takes like 9 months to get there. So now you're running into big problems. If you go up there and everything's hunky dory with your sight, leaving 2020, everything's great. Now all of a sudden you can't see, Yeah. Like, I don't need to tell you. Like,
No,
it's like a major
not
issue.
Good. It's not good.
Right?
Trust me.
So like especially if you're used to having that sensory there, So these are just big question marks that we don't fully understand. Another thing like that's been interesting to me too is exposure to microparticles. Right? If you go to the Kennedy, have you been at the Kennedy Space Center?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go to like the Apollo Launch Center there. They had the big Saturn V rocket, and then they have this like vault that has all these old artifacts that have been in space. One of the things they have there is Al Shepard's spacesuit, and it's got moon dust all over it from when he was on the moon, right? One of the things that's very interesting is that's a particulate matter, that moon dust, and we don't fully understand what that does to the respiratory system. Right, we're used to dust, the body's used to dust and all those things.
Interesting.
But there's pathogens and things like that could grow on that could make us sick. And going in and out of like a habitat on the moon, you could run into issues like that, right?
Wow.
Where now all of a sudden people are getting sick with this unknown pathogen, that's
How do you treat it?
Exactly, we don't know how to treat it. How drugs respond in microgravity could be different. So there's just like a lot of things we take for granted that they may not work at all, or they're going to work completely different in space. So that's one thing I thought's been, pretty interesting too, is we did pitch one of those ideas to NASA. And yeah, we'd like to study that a bit further, try to understand what lunar dust is doing to pulmonary function or lung function.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. A little segue, but also on altitude on training. Sometimes you see in the movies, or even certain fighters would train high altitudes.
Yeah.
And so, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So that's like a deep topic for sure. And we could really get into a lot of that stuff. I'm certainly not the expert. It's one thing you learn when you get into science, and I think when you really dive into anything heavily enough, you realize like you're not an expert. And the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know, it goes deep. But one of the things that's come about as I've kind of gone down the road of studying hypoxia and low oxygen, and high altitude environments, is understanding how the body responds and what that means for training. So one of the things that's kind of been surprising to me is you don't necessarily want to go and train at high elevations. The thought that I was always kind of brought up, like you mentioned, like Rocky and things like that.
Yeah.
You go and like you live in the mountains and you train and you get used to it, right? You acclimatize to being at those high elevations and training up there, so you're used to it. And you'll hear this all the time, dude. Like UFC fights, like all that stuff. Like, oh, they're at altitude. It's like, dude, you're at like 3,000 feet. Like you're not at high altitude right now for some of these fights, you know. But that, you know, the thought is like, well, we live at altitude, we train at altitude, and then we come down and we're like badasses, right? We're able to like perform better. But the problem with that is, and Ben Levine, he's a cardiologist that he spearheaded a lot of this work in like the 90s. The problem with it is you run into issues being at that elevation. And what I mean by issues is you go to elevations, you start breathing more, right? We talked about that. There's less oxygen per breath. One of the things that happens when you breathe is you get rid of CO2, right? That's respiration for you, right? So we take oxygen in and we expire CO2. When CO2 is in solution or in your blood, it acts as an acid. Okay, so one of the primary functions of your lungs is to regulate the acid-base balance of your blood. So when you breathe more, you get rid of more CO2. You can actually change the pH of the blood transiently. And this happens when you go to altitude. If we have an acute response or a quick response when we go to altitude, let's do that trip again, right? Let's go from Hilo in Hawaii and sea level. And we've been living at sea level, and we drive up and we stay at Mauna Kea. We start breathing more when we're up on the summit of Mauna Kea. And that increases our CO2 blow off, if you will. And that's going to cause our pH to increase. Okay. So we're getting less acidic because we're getting rid of that CO2. The body doesn't like that. It likes its pH to be around 7.4. Okay. Like, that's the happy place. Okay. So if it starts to creep up or if it starts to go down, the kidneys will fix this. By the way, like drinking alkali water doesn't do that. Your kidneys do this, guys. So yeah, that response then to that high altitude is to get rid of what we have in our blood that makes it more basic, bicarbonate. So the kidneys will clear out the bicarbonate, and that will bring that pH back down and make it more acidic, right? Bring the blood back to its correct acid-base balance, which is good, right, in the short term. But when you exercise really hard, like, you know, we were talking about earlier, like when you're in a jiu-jitsu tournament and you had your guard closed and it was full guard and you're contracting your muscles, what did your muscles feel like in that moment?
Oh my God, like jello.
Yeah, they're jello. And before that, during the event, what did they feel like?
Oh, I mean, you know,
it's like it's hard.
Yeah,
right? It's tough. And then when you're like contracting them for a long time, really you're doing sprints. How do your muscles feel? Think about like going up stairs. You get like a burn. Yeah, right? You feel the burn. Mm-hmm. All right, that burning is due to a change in pH. The muscles contract, and when they're using glycolytic metabolism, they're kicking off acid, hydrogen ions, right? And so we have bicarbonate to buffer that acid. So the problem is when we go to altitude, we live at altitude. I'll bring it back full circle now. We have a transient lowering of that buffering capacity of our blood, so our ability to deal with acid goes down. Okay. So now if we come back down to sea level and we start trying to perform, I've got less ability to deal with the acid that makes my muscles burn. And so what happens? Your performance suffers. A famous example of that is when Jim Ryan faced Kip Keino in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. Okay. So Jim Ryan was he's picked to win the mile. I think it's the event that he famously lost to Kip Keino. But he went and he trained at elevation, whereas Kip Keino's come from generations at altitude. And you don't get this problem if you've got generations and generations of living at altitude. You got to pick your parents correctly, right? Yeah. Genetics always win. So yeah, Jim Ryan really suffered that event. He was picked to win, but he lost a tremendous loss there. And I've got actually a slide that I show in my class of him getting beat by Kip Keino, Jim Ryan getting beat by Kip Keino. So that's a consideration, right? So what Ben Levine, the cardiologist and physiologist, has kind of shown is that you want to live high and train low. So you want to live at high altitude at nighttime and sleep at a high altitude. So you get these increases in blood cells, red blood cell production. So hematopoiesis happens. And by the way, that doesn't happen very quickly. That takes weeks to occur. Okay. and you need to be exposed to it for about 12 hours. So you need to be in like a room like this that's at low oxygen environments for long enough, right? And really, like, no one's really sleeping 12 hours every day. You know what I mean? So like, you can't just like do it for sleeping. You're good to go.
Yeah.
But you can spend enough time at those high elevations to then get that effect. And then instead of training at that high elevation where it's going to suck and you're not going to have as high of intensity of workout as you would if you were to go down to sea level, you go down to sea level and you're able to have a higher intensity workout. And that added oxygen flow into the mitochondria, which is what produces ATP, energy for your muscles, that helps them adapt as well. You get a better workout, more intense because you're at a nice high oxygen environment. And then you would go back up to, further reap those benefits of the high altitude afterwards.
Oh, that's interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of like the primary school of thought is live high, train low. And that's, the real basic version of it there that gets deep because there's just a lot of considerations, right? When you sleep in a hypoxic environment or a low oxygen environment, you're not going to sleep well. So if you don't sleep well, your recovery is not going to be well.
Correct.
You don't recover well, your performance suffers. And on top of that, what else happens? Well, you get sick, right? Mm-hmm. You're more susceptible to viruses, colds, those types of things. And that's not going to help you perform well either. And that can totally throw off your entire performance, right?
Oh, yeah.
Your race prep or your fight prep, like whatever you're trying to do, right?
Yep.
So those are all things you have to consider.
Yeah, even in the military, I was talking when I was deployed, our sleep patterns were stable. Yeah, because sometimes you just sleep, sometimes you didn't.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get like 4 hours of sleep or 5 hours of sleep, and you didn't. And it was like a year and a half of my life back in the 20s. Now I'm 43. I'm still reaping the consequences of that year and a half that when my sleep was like shit.
Yeah.
And that's why I had insomnia now. It's like it's crazy how the body, one bad move you do, how the ripple effect.
Yeah, and there's some studies too that I've seen. Like one of them was like a Nature publication. So Nature's a big kind of like one of the premier journals for science, right? Next to the one called Science. So Nature's a big one. They show that you get these massive changes in your microbiota. So like the bacterial mix that's in your intestines when you travel to a different time zone. So your circadian rhythm gets disrupted. That also disrupts the symbiotic relationship that you have with the bacteria in your intestines and your digestive system, which we're now learning that impacts cardiovascular health, mental health, like all these other aspects of your whole body's health. So things like that really, they mess you up. And, I think this is happening and has happened since the dawn of times, but at least I shouldn't say that, since the dawn of the aviation age when we can change these time zones so quickly, So like the Air Force, for example, like they'll travel this flight crews, they'll travel to a 12-hour time difference, right? And they'll be on the other side of the world, and then they're supposed to go to required crew rest, and sleep when their body's like, now I'm supposed to be awake. It's like, 10 in the morning, my body's time. Yeah. But no, in reality, it's 10 p.m. and they're supposed to be going to bed because they have to turn around and fly in the morning, local time there. So, there's pharmacological interventions that, they use, Ambien's one of them, things like that they try to use to get around that. But there's just no substitute to like allowing your body to fix it for itself. And so there's long-term consequences to that. And we're just now starting to like ask those questions and study that stuff.
All these people who are retired pilots saying the damage to their body all those years.
One of my best friends is dealing with it. Yeah, he's got issues, and it's not like that, but he's got consequences from those. It's got to be from the sleep and stress, man. The flight crew issues, and turnaround, and there's just fallout from that. You can't tax your body like that for that long a time and then just like expect it to just absolve. We deal with it pretty well in our 20s, in our younger years. But like you're saying, right? Like you feel it more and it rears its head, it manifests and shows up later in life.
Yeah, and I think about it, thinking back to it, for a year and a half while being deployed, our sleeping patterns were never appropriate. and
Yeah.
even where I was, it makes sense. But even when you're sleeping, you weren't sleeping because you're thinking about what's going to happen, or things happening that, going around that wake you up. So it's not really an appropriate environment to get any good rest.
Yeah. And it's a new environment too.
Correct.
Even just traveling, and you're in a hotel room, even if it's quiet, dark, and cool like it's supposed to be, it's still a new environment. Your body knows that too.
Yeah, for us, it's like 8-hour difference.
Mm-hmm.
So on top of that, like you said, my body didn't get used to it.
Yeah.
So then coming back from that and then trying to readjust to that, it's not.
Yeah, it really messes with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of things to study in that regard too, and try to help figure out and mitigate. Because there's military flight crew, but there's also just like, standard flight crew for the general aviation public and like Delta and things like that. That we rely on all the time.
Right.
Whether they're pilots or flight attendants. The safety and operation of those aircraft comes down to them being able to perform their job, and so you have to weigh those cost-benefit ratios, with turnaround times for aircraft and angry passengers with safety. And obviously safety's got to come first. And any company will say that it does. But there's loss of revenue and things like that, because of ill or, flight crew that are not ready to go. And
Correct.
What you don't want though is to get flight crew sort of pigeonholed into taking flights they're not supposed to be taking.
Yeah.
Or thinking they're good, which is usually what you're going to get. Somebody's like, I'm good to go. When in reality,
you don't want to hear that.
No. Yeah. So that can be, and is a problem, right? That's when you get accidents.
Well, hearing all these things that we're talking about today, it's one thing I can think about from it is that it's important to take care of yourself.
Yeah. Yes.
It's really important.
Essential. Yeah. And like exercise, that's like what you've got to do. We're learning now that exercise is essential for healthy aging. Strength training plays a big role in that. It's called sarcopenia, loss of muscle cell function as you get older. All that stuff happens with aging, but it can be the rate of which that occurs can be reduced and is reduced with exercise training.
Even bone density when you're lifting weights.
Same thing. Yeah. Yeah. And I've heard it said like this before, there's no debate. People talk about like saving for retirement. Like it's not a big deal. Like obviously you're going to save for retirement, but what they don't do is they don't prepare their body for retirement. Right. So they're not working with that. So the cool thing, like saving for retirement, you get like nothing in the short term, right? You like $500 you put into like your savings account or your retirement account. That's gone. You don't get it now. You get it later and it benefits you later.
Yeah.
But with exercise, you get the benefit later that you get from treating your muscles and your body and your bone structure well and your nervous system well in the long term. So you're ready to continue doing your things you like to do when you're older. But you also get short-term benefits too.
Yeah.
Right.
And you enjoy your retirement then.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So your functionality, think of it like that. You're not trying to be like an elite athlete, right? You're trying to like do things you want to do. And so you ask people like what they want to do in their 70s, and they'll say stuff like, "Oh, I want to go like skiing and things like that, like fun, or go surf and things like that." And they're able to do that. They say that because they're doing that now, but like you're gonna decline. Like that decline's gonna happen in functionality. So what you want is a higher starting point, so that you can decline and that you can still be where you're at to do surfing or whatever you want to do, jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, that's my plan.
Like when you're those ages, right? So to do that, you have to set yourself up for success now. And that starts just like now, like anything you do is going to help. Like anything is better than nothing. And that is a very true statement for sure.
So any future, projects, or research that you're planning to do or you have in sight? Yeah.
I mean, we've got that respiratory muscle training project, currently in review. The National Institutes of Health, which is, kind of the main, one of the main funding sources for health science research in the United States. That's in review there. And then, ideally, there's some recent releases from the Air Force that are short-term projects that we might be able to swing into trying to improve warfighter performance. So there's two different aspects to that, right? The NIH has the patient paradigm. So we focus more specifically on respiratory muscle function for people that have like recently been in the ICU, it's intensive care unit, where they've been on mechanical ventilation. So on a ventilator, right, that's breathing for them. So when you put somebody on a ventilator, the respiratory muscles aren't working. So they atrophy or they weaken really quickly, very quickly. Wow. So trying to get them off of the ventilator is tough. And sometimes they can't come off the ventilator, and that leads to, a bad outcome. Wow. So if we can prehabilitate these people instead of rehabilitate them, right, we can prehabilitate them with some sort of training we were just talking about, right? Like trying to make you ready. But maybe that's an invasive surgery, or like, helping elderly folks, older individuals that can deal with being sick a little bit better. They're more resilient. These are things that, we're hoping the NIH will see the value in. So those are a couple projects there. And then we've got Summation Athletics too, coaching company that we've worked with a few adaptive athletes to help them go do their activities. Right? We got one girl that's she's got a fully fused spine. That's done 2 attempts of a ski traverse in the Wind River Range. She'll be the first adaptive athlete to do that.
Wow.
She had her intestine actually perforated in those last attempts. They had to get like helied out. So she had a heli evacuation, like terrible weather.
Wow.
Barely got out and has been recovering from that. But we've got some pretty amazing athletes that are working through our company there with that. So that's kind of the thing, man. The lab, jiu-jitsu, life, and training and helping other people, man.
You have a website or something for your company?
Yeah, it's just summationathletics.com.
And social media you have like that?
Yeah, it's Summation Athletics on Instagram. Yeah, at Summation Athletics, SUMMATION. Athletics. So that's us on Instagram. And then I think that's pretty much it. We website, everything's on there, contact in there. Right. And if you're in public service, you get 50% off. So that covers everything from like police and military to like teachers.
Awesome.
Students, same thing. That should make things much more accessible for anybody. If anybody's working through stuff, the goal is to get people like active. Just reach out to us. Like we can definitely work with whatever you're able to work with.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. That's a great thing you're doing.
Yeah, we started that in 2019, which was tough because we had like people that were doing races, like running, like road races and stuff like that, and then COVID. So we were kind of hamstrung with that, but it helped us. We actually rebranded and like launched our logo and stuff then.
Okay.
We had a little bit of time to do that.
Yeah. Kind of worked out, huh?
So yeah, but yeah, check us out there for sure.
And more than interesting, hear you all these things you're talking about, the research, how you started from in college to like not caring that much about anything.
Yeah, almost failing.
Yeah, and
failing.
and look at you today. It's I learned a lot. I learned a lot of also your research and things you're doing today. And I want to thank you for your time. Hopefully, in the future, we'll have you again.
Yeah, man.
Next time we meet, you'll be in with NASA.
Yeah.
That'll be cool.
Yeah, maybe I'll be an astronaut. I applied for that, so NASA, check out my application, man. I'll go to space for you.
Hell yeah. Thank you for your time today. It was a very educational episode, say the least. Learned a lot from how the body works and doesn't work, and how even the whole thing for space was really interesting. And for people out there listening to our podcast, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you next time.